This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hot cakes. Welcome to Hot Take, the podcast where we talk about the climate crisis and all the ways we're talking and not talking about it. I'm Amy Westervelt.
And I'm Mariana Hegler. This episode, we are going to talk to Antonia Juhasz, who is a longtime climate reporter, but with a specific focus on oil and war, which is the theme of this episode. Climate change and war, oil and gas and war, oil in war. We're going to get into all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's right. It's actually, it turns out to be good timing because I feel like this thing about greening the military is back in the headlines all of a sudden. So we're going to talk about that too.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Greening the military is in killing people with solar energy.
More war, but make it green.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. And war is the most carbon intensive activity there is known to man. So anyway, spoiler alerts are done now. We have a great episode for you and we can't wait to share it with you. So with that, you ready?
Yeah. It's time to talk about climate.
There's a lot going on in the world right now, and the Skim is here to help you cut through the noise.
Meet Skim This, a weekly podcast that makes it easier to understand how the news impacts you.
They break down the most complicated stories of the week and add context and clarity to answer the questions that are on your mind.
Yeah, and to help explain why what happened this week matters, both in the short term and the long term.
Subscribe and listen every Thursday evening on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. My Skim story is that when we had offices, we shared a floor with the Skim.
That's hilarious.
And so my office was mostly women. It was like our main office was in one place, but we had grown so much that the communication staff had to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And so they bought us a place we rented a place that was like 2 blocks away, and we had to share a floor with the Skim. Our communications departments are almost always mostly female, and ours is no exception. And the Skim was definitely mostly female. Why were there 2 men's rooms and 1 women's room? Explain that. We had to wait to pee all the fucking time. In case you didn't know, we have a newsletter in addition to this podcast. It comes out once a week, and it includes a digest of all of the week's greatest climate coverage, as well as a couple of features from me and Amy.
That's right. We have features and analysis. Sometimes we have Q&As in there. Sometimes we have guest contributors, and we have a free version that gets you at least 1 feature and the reading digest, and then the paid version gives you everything. Our paid subscribers also get some amount of bonus content and our special hot take cocktails.
They do, and they get ad-free versions of this show. So if you are not signed up, make sure that you do that. The link will be in our show notes, and the free version is definitely worth your time, and the premium version is definitely worth your money.
Antonia Juhasz,
welcome to Hot Take. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be on with both of you. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, us too. Do you want to give us a little bit of intro to yourself and kind of how you started looking at the oil and war intersection?
Sure. So I am an investigative journalist. I'm the author of 3 books, and I also am an analyst. My background is in public policy, both my undergraduate and graduate work, and I worked as legislative assistant for 2 U.S. members of Congress. And I didn't find oil and war. Oil and war found me the same way the oil industry found me. I had been focusing on issues related to corporate power. Basically, I left Capitol Hill because I was disenchanted with the role of corporations in policymaking, and that had nothing to do with my offices that I worked for in particular, which were great offices. It was just the overriding power that I think as going in as a young 26-year-old, I just didn't anticipate, and so I left to address those issues of corporate power over democracy. And as the years moved into the Bush administration, the oil industry was just so predominant within that administration that you couldn't write about politics and corporations or think about them without thinking about oil. And then that just became, unfortunately, it never went away as my driving concern because it didn't go away as an issue. And that then melding investigative journalism with looking at oil and the way oil overlaps with everything became my career. Basically, oil as it winds its way through human rights, climate, justice, war, peace, health, you name it, became my frame. But for a good solid, for many, many, many years, oil and war dominated a lot of my thinking because it's what dominated the Bush administration and the oil industry with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. That totally makes sense.
Yeah. So one of the reasons we wanted to have you on the show is I think that people often think of war or wars being fought for oil to the point that it's become pretty much a cliche. And probably the biggest case of that is the Iraq War, which you've written a great deal about. So I was wondering if you could break down for us just exactly how that happened, how it was a war for oil. Yeah, because I think that actually gets lost.
Yeah, sure. I think, I wrote about this in 2 books, in The Bush Agenda and The Tyranny of Oil, and have written a lot of articles on the topic. And my overriding, point that I drive home is that this was, this was not a war that was only fought for oil. There were other reasons, and that is usually how wars happen. It's very difficult to build up a constituency that is willing to go to war unless you can point to a lot of winners, potential winners, right? So there were a lot of different interests that put us into the war in Iraq. But the first thing to say is it wasn't a war about September 11th, because what's very clear is that the planning for the Iraq war began well before September 11th occurred.
And who did that planning?
So the people who became all of the lead members in the Bush administration had spent years talking about and planning and stating that they wanted to go back to Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein after the failed intervention of the senior Bush administration.
Right. So that would be during the Clinton years, am I right?
No, not during the Clinton years. So these were all of the people who were out of office in between. So when the Clinton administration came into power, all of those Bush senior folks who then became Bush junior folks were out of office plotting. And one of the things they were plotting, and they were very clear, the thing that they were plotting to achieve was American empire. Those were their words. They were very clear about it. That was their intention. And they really wanted to go back to Iraq. That was sort of a central location. With these players, their relationship to the oil industry was always intense, but it was really with George W. Bush, the oil industry spent more money on any election, any presidential election up to that point to get George W. Bush in office. There's only two presidents in U.S. history who came out of the oil industry. That's George Bush Sr. and and the younger George Bush. Dick Cheney, the vice president, had a tenure at the head of Halliburton, the world's largest energy services company. George W. Bush, his longest career was actually running the Texas baseball team, but other than that, he had also worked in the oil industry like his father. And they got these oil men into office, and then the industry was both solidly within the administration and outside of it pushing and to gain greater control of oil, and the central location for doing that was Iraq.
Yes. Hold on. So in these rooms planning this basically second coming of the Iraq War, because I think I'm old enough to remember the first one, Desert Storm. I don't know if everybody else does.
You mean Operation Desert Storm? Yes.
I do remember Operation. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. And how that was supposed to have been like, mission accomplished. We did it. And then how much oil was in these rooms planning the second part two of this?
Part two. So just within days of taking office in 2000. So of course, September 11th wasn't until September 11th, 2001. So within days of taking office, the members of the Bush administration formed under Dick Cheney's guidance, the Cheney, what became known as the Cheney Energy Task Force. And every leading oil company CEO participated in that task force, as well as oil industry people within the administration, such as Dick Cheney. And what we know is that from the earliest days, one of the things that they did within the task force was look at a series of maps and lists that listed out all of Iraq's oil fields. And there was a list that was called Foreign Suitors for Iraqi Oil. So at this stage, Iraq's oil was closed to Western oil companies. It was closed to all foreign oil companies because of the sanctions imposed on Saddam Hussein as a result of the first Gulf War. But Hussein was in discussions with oil companies from China, with oil companies from France, with oil companies from other countries, that if the sanctions were lifted, and there was a good chance that they might be at this point, all of that oil would go to all of those other countries and companies, and the US and the British, in the form of BP, would be shut out. And we know that the war planning also began at this same time. And then those same people, those same CEOs who worked at oil companies and executives who worked at oil companies then were put on the ground after the invasion to run Iraq's oil company, and were put in places within the U.S. government and outside of the U.S. government to write out what Iraq's oil future would look like and who the oil would go to. And the end result of that was Exxon, Chevron, BP, ConocoPhillips, Halliburton, all got access to the largest oil fields in the world, which they had been shut out of prior to the invasion. So it was a very successful war from their perspective.
And you said something about American empire, like that was their explicit goal. Can you say a little more about what they meant when they said that?
And they wanted a world in which the U.S. military was, used to secure a rebirth of American empire. It's a Trump's America First, concept, just a little less simplified, I guess. They wanted to rule the world. I mean, it's very simple. They had lots of grand theories around why that was a good idea, but they were very explicit that the U.S. military and the U.S. government were tools of empire building. Now, I'll say Trump's model is different. It's not driven. It's a combination of isolationism and America Firstism. So it's not doesn't use the military at all in the same way as the Bush folks did. But also, the Bush administration worked hand in hand with an oil industry that had also had 150 years of experience working hand in hand with militaries around the world. So the oil industry and the militaries are very united in their objective, and the oil companies also saw the U.S. military as a tool of their objectives. So the one thing I would just say is, I do not believe that the Iraq War was a war that was fought because the United States believed that control of Iraq's oil was good for the U.S., that it would bring more oil to the U.S. in that way. I believe that it was for the oil companies to have control of the oil to then do with what they would want to do and for the profits that they would generate from that. But from the perspective of the U.S. government, it was to deny the power of that oil to other countries, other governments.
An interesting point of differentiation. Yeah, that's really interesting that it's not even so much to get it for America, but to stop, other from getting in there. That's interesting.
I mean, as a petty bitch myself.
Yeah, yes. Go on. Instruct
I would
us,
do
please.
some shit like that. I'm not gonna lie. But not with oil. Not with oil.
Yeah.
I think that they wanted to deny. So Saddam Hussein had been someone who was very much within control of the U.S. government for decades and was a creation of the U.S. government. He then became rebellious and powerful in his rebellion, and he had a lot of power in that rebellion because of his oil. So getting rid of his, the potential that the U.S. government believed that he had, or the Bush administration, believed that he had to unsettle U.S. strategic interests across the Middle East was dealt with by taking away him and taking away his oil. But it also, again, explicitly served the interest of U.S. oil companies to gain access to the world's largest pool of oil at a time when their biggest problem at that time, this is before the gates were unleashed and the policies eliminated that kept them away from lots of other places where there was oil. We used to have a bit more restrictions on where oil companies could go for oil. So you didn't have the fracking boom at that time. You didn't have the same level of access to offshore drilling. You didn't have the same level of access to tar sands. This was a time when there was a great concern that there wasn't enough oil, and certainly that the oil companies didn't have enough oil. So they saw this prize as necessary, vital to their survival, and they got it.
That's super interesting.
Have you seen the Dave Chappelle skit about the Iraq War?
What about people who say you're only interested in the Middle East for oil?
What? Huh? Oil? Who said something about oil, bitch? You cooking? Oil? Come on, y'all, get out of here!
President Bush met with UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and made it clear the U.S. will act, even if the UN is reluctant.
UN, you have a problem with that? You know what you should do? You should sanction me. Sanction me with your army. Oh, wait a minute. You don't have an army. I guess that means you need to shut the up. That's what I do if I didn't have no army. I would shut the up. I got a coalition of the willing. I got 40 nations. Ready to roll, son.
Like who?
Who said that? Huh? Like who? England. Japan's sending PlayStations. Stankonia said they're willing to drop bombs over Baghdad. Rickety Row is coming. Africa Bambaataa and the Zulu Nation. That means I am not doing this by myself, and I'm not disrespecting the UN, even though they don't got no army. Go sell some medicine, bitches! Trying to get that all.
like it slips out. But so what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that this was never about weapons of mass destruction or human rights.
It was certainly never about weapons of mass destruction or human rights. Absolutely. It was about Israel. It was about there were other things that it was also about.
Right.
It wasn't, you can't, it's like I said, it's very hard to get the United States to launch a war. You got to come up with a lot of reasons for it. But I believe that their overriding interests, those that perpetrated the war, one of the key overriding interests was to get the oil. And I'll just say, in the first Bush administration, for example, was completely upfront about this. There was a memorandum for the war that was said, we can't allow Saddam Hussein to, get this oil. And that first administration, the difference was that the oil industry, I believe, wasn't as needing of the war at that point. So the war kind of stopped short. And the second Iraq war didn't stop short. It kept going, full in invasion, full in occupation, full in write the new rules, including the new rules for controlling the oil, stay there, occupy it. This was, where the first Iraq war was kind of a tepid, maybe if we threaten Saddam Hussein, we'll go. I mean, not tepid if you lived in Iraq and were an Iraqi citizen or a member of the military, you had to fight the war, but tepid in comparison to the second Iraq war. In the second Iraq war, I believe the oil industry in particular needed this war and so got it.
Wow.
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel like, I just feel like this is such a kind of typical thing that happens where there are all of these different drivers, right? Like you have the oil companies are pushing for something. You have this concern that Saddam is going to use the power of having all this oil to, tell the U.S. to fuck off. You have concerns about Israel. You have, just like all of these things coming together. And so I don't know. I feel like we often do this thing where we want a simple story. So we want to say, oh, the U.S. is hungry for oil, and that's why we just invaded Iraq to take it. And it's like, kind of, but there's more to it.
Yeah, there's some of everything.
Well, and I think that also, that line missed a lot of the point, which is that because that also became this, there's a good reason for the war because the U.S. needs oil and Iraq has oil and we should get that oil. That's good for us. That really wasn't the motivation. The U.S. imports of Iraqi oil didn't change dramatically during this time. The U.S. oil companies weren't securing Iraq's oil for America. They were securing Iraq's oil for themselves, and they sold it to the highest bidder. Like they sold it around the world. They didn't sell it to us,
right?
Or they sold some of it to us, just the same amount. And so, whereas say World War II or earlier wars had a much more of a the United States is tromping around the world, and one of the reasons why it's doing it is to secure oil for itself. That was not the case by the time we get to the Iraq War.
Yeah. What I can't get off my mind is that at the time that they're doing this and causing all of this destruction, at least largely in the name of oil, they knew about climate change.
Sure. I mean, certainly, yes. I mean, so that's a brilliant point. So the oil companies, back in, the mid 70s, knew that the burning of fossil fuels not only caused climate change, but would have devastating effects through the warming of the planet. This, not just aware of it, but aware of the harms. And then, at the same time, as you suggest, not only with Exxon, then sits on that knowledge, then funds the denialist movement that denies that knowledge, but is also, tromping around the world to acquire more oil and putting us through, a devastating war. I think also, maybe for younger listeners, the human and environmental and economic and social and political costs of the Iraq War is, just incalculable. Just lives lost, nation destroyed, a region destabilized. And so I think that it's worth looking at that. And I also, and I think it's important to always talk about Afghanistan within the context of Iraq, because to me, the members of the Bush administration, as I said, had intended to go to war in Iraq. September 11th happened, and the perpetrators of September 11th were in Afghanistan. So September 11th provided what became the excuse for the invasion of Iraq, but it didn't really make sense because the perpetrators of the war weren't in Iraq. The perpetrators of the war were in Afghanistan. So if you want to invade Iraq on the idea that it's about September 11th attacks, but you're not invading Afghanistan, that doesn't make any sense. So I believe that we invaded Afghanistan as simply see, we do care about September 11th. Look, we're invading Afghanistan, and now we're going to invade Iraq because, see, that's clear that it's about September 11th. And of course, then that is the double enormous global tragedy, the longest war the U.S. has ever been engaged in, the devastation of the Afghanistan war, of course, to the people of Afghanistan, the soldiers who had to fight there, the region again. So I reported across Afghanistan looking at the role of oil and gas in that war. And in that war, it was really just this sort of attempt at a bonus. Like, we're in Afghanistan, there is oil and natural gas here, let's see if we can get it. And that never happened because Afghanistan was both wars were, of course, terrible decisions to make, but Afghanistan, there was just no way that the United States, if it had learned any lesson from anything in the past, was going to do anything in Afghanistan other than create greater harm. And it was never been stable enough to get oil and natural gas. So if you are someone who believes that oil and natural gas are, useful or, would be good for the economy or whatever, there was just never enough stability ever achieved in Afghanistan to ever really pursue the oil and natural gas. Instead, as I reported on sort of traveling across the north of Afghanistan, it became a point of confrontation where the Taliban was also focused on these areas because the U.S. government was focused on these areas, and it was creating even greater instability that the U.S. government was interested in pursuit of the oil and natural gas in Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's such a sad story because the effects of these wars are still happening today, right? Like, that's a big part of why they're incalculable. I was reading a story that came out this summer about the health impacts for people who live in, I believe it's Basra, in Iraq. Is that right? Did I get that name right? Yeah. And how there's like open flaring, and like there are children who have never seen darkness at night because there's open flaring from all the natural gas wells. And the cancer rates are just through the roof. But at the same time, folks have been made economically dependent on the oil industry. And so if it leaves, they wouldn't be able to afford their treatment for all the illnesses that they've been left with. And it's just, goodness. Yeah.
Yes.
It's crazy. It's like, it drives me, it's the thing that makes me the most mad when I see the like Bush rehabilitation tour happening right now.
Oh my God.
Like,
how do you feel about that?
Yeah. I mean, so this started early on in the Trump administration, which was these sort of voices of reason were coming from the members of the Bush administration, which I found, deeply upsetting. There was no way that we were going to get out of the Trump administration by turning to the Bush administration for guidance. I think George W. Bush, the good thing about George W. Bush is that he probably never really wanted to be president, and he still doesn't. And so he doesn't say much. Like he shows up for the inauguration, which he should. I think that's really appropriate that we have
the bar is low.
Presidents lined
up. The bar
up.
is low.
I mean, yeah, like he's kind of like I said, he ran a baseball team. I think that was when he was his happiest. I wish we'd let him keep doing that. But fortunately, he doesn't say much. I do think, as you're saying, like the rehabilitation of the members of his administration is. Deeply worrisome if we're going to learn the lessons of what went wrong there and not, to actually undo the harm that's happened within the Trump administration. Yeah, that's not.
It just also reminds me so much of, I just finished this reporting project on Chevron in Ecuador, and Texaco before that, and everything that they left behind there. And I think that that we don't talk enough about oil colonialism in general, and just the long arm of that. That it's not just that the oil companies go in and they drill and they create this sort of immediate set of problems, but that it kind of sets countries and communities on this course forever.
Right.
These tribes in Ecuador a lot of them had contact with the Western, with the sort of American world forced upon them in this way that has continued to cause problems long after the oil companies leave. So yeah, I don't know. I'm curious about your take on that stuff too, Antonia. I know you've looked at sort of the colonialism side of the coin too.
Yeah, and I think that the story of Chevron and Texaco and Ecuador is a really important story. I've also reported from Ecuador on that piece, and also the expansion of oil operations, not just in the region. This is decades long pollution, and just how do you summarize Chevron in Ecuador? I think basically just operating with impunity and using the worst practices possible within indigenous lands in Ecuador, and just enormous pollution over decades and decades and decades, and fighting still for the requirement that it pay a judgment of nearly $10 billion for that cleanup, which it refuses to pay. And I think the story of oil expansion across the United States and across the world is oil companies partnering with governments and militaries or police forces or private police forces to acquire oil that is primarily found on indigenous people's lands. So that's sort of the early history in the United States. I think one of the key places to look at is the Osage. They became the most murdered population in the United States, and the primary reason why was the success in taking over their oil in Oklahoma, and the drive to remove them. And this happened to many Native American communities, the Ponca in Oklahoma, but Native American communities across the United States. One of the reasons why they got driven from specific tribal areas was to acquire the oil where they were located, and of course in murderous fashion at the hands of the U.S. military. And then if you look at, for example, the Hossocks of Mexico, this was again an early story in the early 1900s, where the company that was a Standard Oil breakup piece, Standard Oil of Indiana, which later became BP, just teamed with the military in Mexico to decimate this Hostok region, which was described as an Eden in an area that is now Veracruz and Hidalgo. Decimated the land, murdered many of the people, took the land, forced many of the Hossocks to then become forced laborers, to work for the oil companies. This is a model played out, across the world. And then just this model of teaming with militaries to acquire and secure oil. So you've got ExxonMobil in Aceh, Indonesia. You've got Chevron and Shell in Nigeria. You have essentially the creation of many countries within the Middle East as a result of the U.S. and the British divvying up their lands to and calling them countries to help gain acquisition to their oil. This is a story that we can talk about for a long time, but a lot of Western power is derived from this forcible acquisition of oil on behalf of Western oil companies from indigenous peoples, around the world. And I think, again, where this started originally with Native American communities in the US, a lot of this was then offshored so that Americans didn't see this for most decades of the history of
kind
oil.
of similar to
It
the
happened.
Iraq War, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And the Afghanistan
Yep.
War, right? Because it's also fought by this, handful of people over and over again.
Exactly. And so you had oil development taking place, far away from where most Americans saw it, and didn't in nations and communities of color. And it didn't, the costs of it weren't as apparent. And then, of course, that really changed with the advent of fracking in the United States, where your average American, your white American, became exposed to oil development in a way that people of color, communities of color, and nations of color had been for decades. And most people, when they're confronted with the realities of oil operations, and it's right next to where they live, don't like it, including the CEO of ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, at one point had a fracking development planned for near his mansion outside of Dallas, and he didn't like that, so he fought against it.
Well, look at that. I was waiting on when he was going to show up. But no, that I think that's a really important point. And also this point about, all of these removals and assaults on indigenous people in the name of oil, those are also oil wars. And I don't think that people quite understand them that way. And so, when I see previously uncontacted tribes in the Amazon realizing that they're under attack, and then suddenly there's this viral video of them, coming to make war with the oil industry or with the government. I'm like, that's a war. It's an extremely unequal war, but it's still a war. And like, to open up drilling in Saudi Arabia and all of that, like, that was war too. And we don't often think of it that way. And there's other oil wars too, like the Iraq-Iran War, the Colombian Civil War. I was reading about the Chaco War between Paraguay and Bolivia in the 30s, which was one country's backed by Standard Oil, the other's backed by Shell. So just, these are things to remember when you're on social media and you see an ad from Shell or Chevron. They deserve every mean thing you can think of to say to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, there's so many important points that you just raised. So I'm trying to figure out like where to jump in. I think the thing that I think is most important for folks to look at, and it's hard to sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, just like not knock it all off my head and our heads to share it in this type of format, but is to go through and look at all of the examples of the oil industry teaming with and using militaries, and supporting and propping up the most brutal dictators in the world as a means to protect and get oil. And of course, where I didn't end that story is, so more Americans have been exposed to the harms of the oil industry with fracking, but what then also came around again and hadn't for decades, really since this time of the Osage, of the Ponca back in the early 1900s, came around again with Dakota Access, Standing Rock. So that was the first time we had seen in decades, the use of U.S. military weaponry, because it was the same weapons, literally repurposed weapons from Iraq and Afghanistan, that were used by the police force in Standing Rock against the Native American communities who had risen up against the pipeline. They, stood head to head against this, militarized police force and private security force with assault rifles loaded and pointed at them, with snipers sitting in assault vehicles, with guns loaded and pointed at them, in a fight to stop the pipeline. And that was an experience that had played out across the world, coming home again to the United States, again at a point where the U.S. industry was sort of that desperate to need to move forward, that it used a militarized force in the U.S. in a way that it hadn't in decades.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's really fascinating. I mean, Standing Rock, I think, is one of the most important movements in the past just decade, honestly. It informed so much of what happened in Minneapolis this summer and across the country. It changed the laws about what's critical infrastructure and what isn't. I mean, yeah, it's a critical thing for understanding not even just the climate movement, but where we're going as a country.
Yeah, and there was, a great deal of overlap in organizing. There was Black Lives Matter groups were very present in Standing Rock. People who'd been present in Standing Rock were on the streets and continue to be on the streets in struggles for Black justice and equity, in protests for years from the beginning. These have been overlapping movements, and of course overlapping struggles, where of course the injustices, the location of production, refineries, transport in the United States until fracking had been largely in of course in communities of color across the U.S.
Right. And I believe Standing Rock was about a pipeline going through what was supposed to be independent Indian land, which you can argue is an act of war, because the U.S.
Right.
government...
I mean, the tribe is a nation, right? It's a political body, and they're breaking a treaty with that nation, and they're supposed to have sovereignty on their land to say no to certain permits,
right? Right.
Yeah, that's...
and the U.S. government definitely reacted like it was war. I mean, they went in with overwhelming force. It was horrific.
Certainly a lot more force than we saw deployed on the Capitol steps.
Well, that's for damn sure. That is for damn sure.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso and Samra Origins by the Weekend Coffee Collection.
Introducing Samra Origins. My collaboration with Nespresso is a connection to my roots, to my mother, Samra. Coffee that hits the right notes. It transports you. Crafted with unique notes and bold, soaring flavors. Experience a taste that moves you. Nespresso and Samra Origins.
Discover more at Nespresso.com.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
So another thing I wanted to talk about some is oil as a weapon of war, because I think we think of oil often just as a catalyst of war, but it works in another way too, because often armies will destroy or preserve oil fields depending on whether they want to take over the country and therefore have the oil fields ready for them to exploit, or if they want to topple the country and therefore not let them, have, quote, an economy after the war.
I know, Antonia, you covered this a bit about Saddam Hussein burning Kuwaiti oil fields to poison and slow down American troops and destroy the fields for both Kuwait and the U.S. I think it was the largest intentional oil destruction in history.
Yes, absolutely, all true. Yes.
And there was some of that in the Vietnam War. There was some of that even in the Korean War, it appears. And there was some of that in the Afghanistan War. I think you were alluding to that, right, Antonia?
Certainly there is a a motivation for in wars for oil that is both about get it for yourself and deny it to the folks who have it. Then you had this new sort of Trump version, which was in Syria. When Trump sent the U.S. military into Syria in 2019, he literally had U.S. troops protecting oil fields that Assad had sold to the Russians. So they were owned by the Russians and being protected by the U.S. military.
Oh, that makes sense.
And so, that makes sense. So you got like Trump just adds this entire new crazy layer onto everything, which is, I believe, Trump had, it's hard to parse out Trump's motivations other than, self-aggrandizement, self-wealth, and self-promotion, and white nationalism and white supremacy. But one certainly way of understanding Donald Trump is understanding his relationship to Putin. And one of the things that he definitely did was join into an alliance with Putin and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to ensure, an attempt to ensure the dominance of oil in particular and fossil fuels more generally through their actions together. And I think Trump did that simply in support of agendas that he had for himself in the Middle East, in protection of Israel, which was also about Jared Kushner's financial ambitions after or even during the term. But that was, basically that sort of crazy turn of events in Syria, because again, like Syria is a war where, I think getting to this point that you had that, I think, in general, oil companies want whatever oil they can get if they can get it, but they have limits. Like they didn't go into Afghanistan. It was too dangerous. I don't think you had oil companies saying to Donald Trump, invade Syria so that we can get the oil. It's just too risky and there's not enough of it. But, at the end of the day, once you're there, would they like it? Sure. But Trump wasn't doing that. Trump was protecting Syria's oil for Putin. And that was a uniquely Trumpian agenda, which was quite successful. I mean, I think that between Trump and Putin and Mohammed bin Salman, that team up for 4 years, they did a lot to secure for a lot of the world a continued deep investment in oil and fossil fuels. And fortunately, there is a simultaneous aggressive pushback in the other direction. But it's not as easy as I think many might believe it would be to make that transition, because you do have very strong governments, even if you have weakening oil companies that still want to maintain oil's dominance.
Yeah, you know who I don't miss in the White House? Donald Trump. I miss him. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's to say the least. I'll agree with you. I'm also thinking about how oil is often used by rebel groups, since so many of these countries have been fractured by like the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, so many other wars, and they're kind of in a lot of places like Yemen. There's a lot of different rebel groups running around, and they take control of different oil fields or different ports so that different oil takers can't dock there. Like I was thinking about this ship off the coast of Yemen, at least as of December, where the port is controlled by this rebel group that won't allow the ship to dock, which means that this tanker has been sitting there forever and it has more oil than the Exxon Valdez. And it's definitely going to spill at some point if it's not taken out of the water. But like there's no government intact anymore. And it's kind of used as this pawn and a weapon. Antonia, I have a quick lightning round for you. So you are on the precipice of a move to Louisiana, to New Orleans, right? Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
So
I am.
I'm jealous of that, and I want to see just how much you know about Louisiana before you go. So first questions first.
Are you guys gonna help?
You can ask Amy for help.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not that helpful, though. That's
Thanks,
the trick
Amy.
there.
So quit stalling.
Okay, Mary.
Why did Louisiana arrest the Mississippi River?
Arrest the Mississippi River? I don't
It
know.
had a dirty mouth.
They're jokes. I'm literally imagining, like soldiers going out to the water.
Yeah, that's called the levee.
Okay,
that was
awesome.
the 1927
Got
flood.
it. Oh, there you go. All right. I got it.
How long does it take to get from Louisiana to Alabama?
I don't know.
1 Mississippi.
Oh no.
What did the girl from Louisiana say when she was leaving?
I don't know.
Bye, you.
Oh, it's so good. So good. Love it. That's awesome.
How does Louisiana hold up its pants?
Something about suspenders. No, something about a belt.
Yes. Something about a belt.
Okay, something about a belt. I don't know.
A Bible belt.
Nice.
Oh.
Okay.
Good. Good.
Not untrue. Yeah.
Oh, this one's bad, and it's gonna be the last one.
Don't do mean ones.
It's not mean, but it's a very climate joke. What is BP using to catch up to 500,000 gallons of crude oil a day?
The Gulf of Mexico?
Ooh,
Close.
That's good, though. That's good. I don't know, but that's good.
Ducks.
Oh.
Oh, God.
I know.
That's even worse.
I know.
Yeah.
Worse.
Like
Sad,
a
but
trillion
true.
birds.
Dolphins. Hey, have you left us a review or a rating yet? If not, why not?
Yeah, come on, get on that.
What the fuck are you doing?
Yeah, 2 things. One, it makes our egos feel good when there are lots of ratings, and it makes us feel bad when there are not a lot of ratings.
Most important part of all of this, okay? Tell us we sound pretty.
Yes. And 2, it is actually the way that Apple decides whether to show your show to other listeners. So yeah, it helps us go up in the charts. It helps us find new listeners, all those things.
Right. And if you have a negative review, we have a special system for that. Make sure you send it to brian.kahn@earther.com. That's BRIANKAHN@earther.com. It'll get to us just in a special package.
Yes. Perfect. Go do that.
So yeah, as someone who's covered this stuff a lot, how do you think that we can better cover the relationship between oil and war in the press?
I think one of the problems with the way a lot of the media still, and it surprises me that it still happens, covers these issues is in these very strange silos that you can somehow separate out foreign policy, climate policy, racial equity, racial justice, environmental policy, climate policy. You have a reporter who covers healthcare over here. You have a reporter who covers racial justice over
Right.
there. You have a reporter who covers business over there. And somehow they're still not exchanging notes. It's happening more and more. It is happening. Like there's some really great coverage, of course, that does, make these linkages, but it still isn't enough. And I think that the best thing that could happen is for your war reporters to be talking to your environmental justice reporters, to be talking to your business reporters, to be understanding those links, and better yet, more importantly, reporting on them and explaining them to readers and responding to readers' concerns about those issues, and to listening to the people on the ground from the very beginning of oil development. For 150 years of oil development, wherever there are people who live where oil is being developed, transported, processed, refined, there are communities resisting. Always. And they experience war. They experience health devastation. They experience inequality. They experience injustice. And if you listen to them and report from that, you will make these connections in your reporting. And I think, that's actually one of the things that I set out to do with my own reporting, was to try and break down those barriers. I created my own nonprofit. It's a project of the Society of Environmental Journalists, which is uncovering oil. And the entire point was to break down those barriers and make those connections. And I think that, is incredibly important. And I think if we now look towards the Biden administration and reporting on the Biden administration, I see this very concerning bifurcation within this administration, which is that foreign policy is dominated by, a former member of the military for the defense secretary. We have a former 4-star general who only stopped being a 4-star general in 2016. So he had to get a special waiver to become defense secretary. He led U.S. forces in the Middle East. He previously served on the board of directors in between his service for 2 military contractors, and he's the defense secretary. You have the national security secretary, and you have Secretary of State, who are both interventionists at heart. And at the same time, you have a government that has put front and center the need to end fossil fuels, the need to combat the climate crisis, to end systemic racism, to infuse government decision-making with environmental justice. And these are contradictory.
Yeah.
And they're not being seen or reported as contradictory. And I think that is deeply problematic, especially as I know something you both wanted to talk about, how climate change is going to continues to cause more instability and potentially.
Right. And also war causes climate change because it's really climate intensive. Sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Exactly. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, I feel like that is a perfect example of why I don't think that this whole having climate as a beat over here works. It's not the type of beat that works with. I feel like you need climate reporters integrated into all of the different other desks and not a whole separate climate desk. I don't know.
Totally. And that's what the Biden administration has done in domestic policy and even in foreign policy. But in foreign policy, it's John Kerry, who's also not the world's most aggressive militarist, but certainly is someone who is a centrist militarist. And I think that what's missing is, as you have framed this entire conversation, is what is the link between militarism and climate change and fossil fuels, and can we proactively see them as things that need to be delinked if we're going to have success addressing the climate crisis and addressing fossil fuels and addressing the administration has said that it wants to address.
This is the thing that drives me crazy about the whole greening the military stuff too, is it's yes, fine, there's so many casualties on refueling missions that it makes sense to have packs with solar panels on them, right? There's that stuff. And yes, war is quite fossil fuel intensive and all of these things. And yes, wars are fought over oil. So it makes sense from all of those fronts too. But then there's not ever, I feel like I so infrequently see people make the next step, which is why so much war though?
No, that's such an important point, because I have to say something that actually grates on me is when people talk about the United States military is the largest user of fossil fuels in the world. That gets said a lot. I've never seen that proven. But for me, the biggest problem is that when that gets said, I actually think, to be honest, that originated with white peace activists who thought that they needed to come up with a way to convince climate folks to be concerned about war. And I just say, if you talk to anyone who's been at the other end of a war, they will tell you about the impacts on their environment, the role of fossil fuels, the role of wars for oil, the role of military being used for oil. They've lived it. So all you need to do is ask them, ask an Iraqi to talk about, was oil part of this war? And they'll explain it to you very well. Ask a Nigerian what it's like to be at the other end of the gun. Ask anyone who's lived those experiences. And I think if you say, okay, the U.S. military uses a lot of fossil fuels and is carbon intensive, that argument did open the door to greening the military. President Obama stood in front of a biofuel jet on the same day that he announced a new massive, deep water oil project to say, look, we're greening the military.
They've been saying it for years. I looked up because I was like, God, I did a series for Forbes on greening the military. Like, it's got to be 10 years ago. And yes, in fact, it is 10 years old, that story. And it was like this big thing. Everyone was like, what? The military cares about oil. And, it was like they had already been putting it in the quadrennial reports for years by that point. Yeah. So it's not new to think about this.
I don't think it's unimportant. Yeah. But I would rather not fly the jets, right?
Exactly.
Don't fly not great. Let's fly the jets as long as they're being flown with biofuels. Let's not fly the jets. So let's, so that, to me, it just sort of lends itself to solutions that aren't actually solutions to the real problem, or the real problems, which are ending the militarism and ending the fossil fuels. And I think if we look at, I actually see there's, a lot of ways to talk about the Capitol Hill riots. One of them is that one of the things that we knew was going to happen with the worsening climate crisis is greater instability, more people becoming more desperate to protect what is theirs. In this case, that is white supremacy and the things that come along with it. But to feel insecure in their world, to need strong autocratic leaders, some people to come up and say, we're going to protect you because the world is becoming deeply, deeply, deeply destabilized. And there are millions of people who don't have homes, who are looking for homes and are coming into your country. And you can either say, oh my God, please come into our country. This is a wonderful thing to have happen. Or you can say, oh my God, I'm terrified of these people coming into my country, and shut the door. And who's going to help me shut the door? And who's going to help me keep them out? And if I keep them out, that'll stop all these other problems that I don't want to see happen. And who's going to, protect me? And greater instability, insecurity, pandemics are part and parcel to a worsening climate. And I think that until we confront the nature of that, who's holding on to what, why are they needing to hold on? We're missing a key piece of the climate crisis. And of course, a fundamental part of that, and what we're talking about, is people. So for example, in Syria is certainly a war that has many causes, but one of them is the worsening climate crisis, which created drought, which ended access to agriculture, which forced people into cities, which created these conflicts within those cities, which led to instability and war fighting. And we are just going to see, there are many, many more places in the world, across Central America, across South America, across Africa, the African continent, across the Russian continent, across the United States, where drought is forcing people to leave, to move. And when people leave and move and we don't respond to that with open arms, the other way that people respond to it is with arms.
This gets into the whole ecofascism thing too, that like the way that I think you're already starting to see people on the right wing in particular going from climate change isn't happening to climate change is my reason for hating immigrants.
Yeah. Immigrants and black people and Jews and all of these other people. Like it becomes this sort of like, well, if there's so, and it gives people a way to rationalize their hatred, right? Because it's like, I mean, I wish it wasn't this way, but if there's only going to be so many resources, I'm going to protect me and mine. And who can possibly blame me for that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrifying development, and it plays out, like basically you could see, Viktor Orban of Hungary, you can see the Trump in the United States, the rise of autocratic regimes, that many of which are a response to fear of immigration, and are strong white men who stood up to say, I'm going to stop Vladimir Putin, I'm going to stop immigrants from coming into our country, and I'm going to suppress indigenous people and peoples of color within my own country. And that, that response to climate change is where, to me, sort of where the biggest, one of the major areas of fear and concern, you need to be fear and concern, because that's going to the movement of people is going to get worse or better, depending on how you see it. Maybe it's a wonderful thing, a beautiful thing, people, moving from country to country. If they are given, access to resources and care and support, that can be a beautiful, wonderful thing. Right. That could be a beautiful outcome of where we are. Or it can be this sort of horrific thing. And that's where I am concerned that we have a foreign policy team within the Biden administration that doesn't say, we need, we really putting front and center the necessity of diplomacy, at the center, at the core of their, what makes them tick. Sullivan, you can say lots of things about the Obama administration, but one of the things about the Obama administration is that Hillary Clinton was one of the more hawkish secretaries of state, in a Democratic regime in a while. And Sullivan was her, sort of right-hand man. And that makes me quite concerned. Antony Blinken makes me concerned. I think that they both have a very good approach to Iran. And if we can talk about Iran and oil for a long time, that's also very important. And I am glad that they have a essentially peaceful focus towards Iran. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that they're not aggressively siding with Saudi Arabia against Iran, which both Trump and Bush did.
What is that? What is the obsession with Iran?
That's a great way of putting it. Iran has, after Iraq and Saudi Arabia, well, now actually, sorry, I'm going to sort of scratch the way that I frame that, because the world has shifted a lot since Iran's oil reserves were at this top tier. But it is still one of the largest oil reserves in the world. A country that's basically been defined by Western powers trying to control it, succeeding in controlling it to get its oil. Like, that's a lot of the history of Iran is foreign powers, the U.S., Britain, controlling that country for its oil. And I think that, Iran has the potential to be the key challenger to Saudi Arabia in the region, just like Iraq had the potential to be a key challenger to Saudi Arabia. And if you want to remove that, and of course, Iran is aggressively anti-Israel. If you want Saudi Arabia and Israel to be preeminent, a weakened Iran is important to that. If you and of course, and also, so one way to deny Iran of its power is to deny it of the wealth of its oil, and I think that the Trump administration was certainly intent on that. The Bush administration was certainly intent on that. I know that Western oil companies would love to get their hands on Iran's oil, but it also has an incredibly powerful military and incredibly strong government. It may or may not have the capacity for nuclear weapons. So it was not nearly as easy a target as Iraq, but it was the target after Iraq. So after Iraq, the Bush administration was very clear that after Iraq was Iran. The Trump administration, I think, was made very clear that it had intentions, hopes, certainly through John Bolton and others, to attack Iran, and just never had. I think there was the one thing that unified the Trump foreign policy in the early days of it was a desire to go after Iran, potentially militarily. In the very beginning of the Trump administration, Trump dropped what is the largest bomb that we have. It's called the mother of all bombs is the name of it. And he dropped the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan, and people were uncertain, including myself, as to why he dropped the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan. And I think it was as a test to see what it looked like and should we use it in Iran. And it just never came to be. The Trump administration was, thank God, too disorganized to or there wasn't the will to do it. But that's still there. So I think one of the really good things about these members of the Biden administration is they don't want war on Iran. I'm sure about that. Yeah.
I mean, this is just, it's like our little rise of eco-fascism now is just like kind of chickens coming home to roost, but in the shittiest possible way for any person of color here, because like, that's not my chicken. So
yeah,
it's
I mean, yeah, and I think those who are suffering the greatest costs of fossil fuels in the climate crisis are those who contributed the least to it. And I think that you would not have the climate crisis if you didn't have racism and racial injustice. You wouldn't be able to place these operations where you're placing them, fight wars and use the military in nations of color and communities of color, put these operations in those locations without obviously systemic racism and inequality. And if you didn't have that, you couldn't have these dirty and polluting operations and these wars, and you wouldn't have the climate crisis. I think that's certainly true. Yeah.
And honestly, that was why I wanted to do the show, is because you were saying earlier, like, ask a Iraqi, ask a Nigerian. I saw someone on Twitter say, like, I hated the fossil fuel industry long before I knew about climate change because of what they did to my country.
I think that's an incredibly important point. And for me, where that becomes such an important point is looking at what are the solutions. So right now, we've got oil companies that are saying, we're going to be the solution. We're going to become green energy companies, and you can trust us to help you make the transition. And, I think there are many reasons to be dubious of that assertion. One is, I think, to look at these issues of human rights abuse. Can I read from something that I wrote, which is so this is a case, John Doe v. ExxonMobil Corporation, which is from Aceh, Indonesia. Among the plaintiffs all of whom use aliases out of fear for their lives, is John Doe 2. According to the complaint, in August 2000, soldiers working for ExxonMobil beat and tortured him using electricity all over his body, including his genitals. After approximately 3 months, the soldiers took off the blindfold, took him outside the building where he had been detained, and showed him a pit where there was a large pile of human heads. The soldiers threatened to kill him and add his head to the pile. He was ultimately released, only to have the soldiers return later and burn down his house. Now, this case is one of many where the principal argument that ExxonMobil is making, Chevron made a similar argument in accusations of gross human rights abuses against it in Nigeria. They don't argue that the events didn't happen. They argue that they're not liable for them as the parent company. Mm-hmm. Same as Ecuador. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know if this happened. This is a complaint, but based on all of the evidence that I have seen and based on all of the evidence on the actions of the Indonesian soldiers at this time, it is a very good bet in my mind that it did happen. And this sort of role of human rights abuse is certainly not isolated to these locations. And certainly if you look at the governments that the ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips have supported, particularly ExxonMobil, these are, as I said in the beginning, some of the most brutal regimes in the world. So first you just have to look at the behavior of the companies, how they have chosen to act. And then you say, how have they chosen to act with this resource? So it's important, I think, to reflect that oil, natural gas, and coal, for that matter, are natural resources. They're not renewable, but they're natural resources. Humans have interacted with these resources and cohabitated with them and used them for millennia. It's just in the last 150 years that these companies, and it's the same companies, have turned them into these massively destructive forces. And so do we really want to turn over to these same companies based on that behavior, the sun and the wind and the waves? Mm-hmm. How are they going to behave in their control of these resources, in their distribution of them, in access to them, in the lengths they'll go to maintain area for solar fields, the resources that they need to expand? And they certainly have a model that is based on mass consumption growth, as opposed to equitable distribution, localized control of resources, limiting consumption of energy to a healthier, sustainable way. And so even if you look at sort of the best promises, right now BP is probably going the furthest in what it's promising it's going to do and how it's going to transition. Even in its best model, its best vision of what it intends to do, 2/3 of its operations are still going to be oil and natural gas 30 years in the future.
Yeah, totally. I think that is the thing that I don't know. I feel like we can't repeat enough, is just that, like, why I still feel like there's so many people who think, oh, it's fine, BP and Exxon will just become solar companies. And it's like they have given us no reason to want them in charge of energy, period. Or anything else. It's like they have, it's like saying, oh, Mitch McConnell is going to compromise. No, he's not. Like, come on, wake up. Yeah. It's just not, we have no evidence that shows that they will do that. And we have decades worth of evidence that shows that they will do everything they can to just protect their profits and, like, screw everybody over. So why would we entrust them with this, like, incredibly important, complicated thing that is so easy to get wrong in so many ways? Yeah.
Well, and I think it's this idea that the answer to our problem is keeping everything the same and replacing fossil fuels with renewables, and then everything will be fine.
Exactly.
And I think that that's at the heart of
It's the power structure, not the power source, people. Like,
That's great.
like,
That's awesome.
it's just, it's so frustrating. It's like, how many examples do we have to see before we realize that? I mean, I feel the same way about the electrification push. It's like, okay, so who's going to be in charge of that? Who's going to be in charge of lithium? What happens when, okay, so Bolivia has a ton of lithium. Are they going to benefit from that? Are the Bolivians going to become a superpower, or are we going to have like U.S. companies going and try to like own their resources before they can even mine them? You know, and yeah, okay, then we're going to be dependent on that resource, and who's going to, yeah.
I think it's important that we it's sort of looking at, so what are the steps along the way? I think many people think, basically we have to act now, we have to act right away. The oil companies have the infrastructure. If they just shifted, then, we would get this sort of massive quick response. And for me, there's, some logic to that, but it's only if you trust those companies. And again, I come to the inequity of their distribution model, a model that is based on constant growth. And we can't consume any energy source in the way that we consume fossil fuels. We can't survive as a planet or a species if we continue to consume in the way, and by we, I mean, primarily wealthy white nations that are doing all of the, like 99% of the consumption. So those people and nations cannot continue to consume in that manner any energy source. What we need to do is live in a much more healthy model of energy consumption, which is much more equitable, which is localized, equitably distributed, equitably resourced, and live, in healthier models of how we move around and how we consume products and how we use agriculture and all of these things. I'm just going to keep using the word healthy, are healthier for us. They're better for us. They're going to make our lives happier and healthier. But they're going to remove power from places that have a tremendous amount of power. And I do think, sort of speaking of power in politics, there is this opening with the Biden administration where I think the reason why I think it's opened up is because I think one of the biggest differences in power between Obama/Biden and Trump/Bush is that Trump and Bush even more so, well, Trump as well, were tied financially to the fossil fuel industry directly and doing its bidding to the T on everything. Obama and Biden are tied to the finance industry. And one of the brilliant things that the climate movement and environmentalists have been doing, environmental justice movement has been doing, indigenous movements have been doing, is working to break that link between the finance sector and the fossil fuel sector, so that they are, for the first time in 150 years, not deeply intertwined with one another, but rather, through divestment movements, aggressively delinked. So the finance sector is now, really extricating itself under the pressure of movements and under the pressure of the success of replacing fossil fuels with other resources where the financial sector is making money, is delinking itself from fossil fuels. So if you have a finance sector that is no longer particularly interested in the fossil fuel industry, then you have a Biden administration, now, that is freed from that link as well. It's, so that it now has a type of freedom from those that back it to move from fossil fuels. And I think that there's a reality in that didn't exist during the Obama era. And I think that, makes me hopeful that we actually are going to see real change from fossil fuels. Then the question is, is that next step also going to be taken, which is that how do we have, a truly just and equitable transition, which will be the healthiest and the safest and the sanest for all of us if we do it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Antonia. We appreciate it. This is great.
You too, both of you. Take care.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you. Bye. Thank you so much to Antonia for joining us for this episode. You can and should follow her on Twitter. She's at Antonia Juhasz, and Juhasz is spelled Juhaszz.
That's right. Antonia is a great investigative reporter. She writes all kinds of good stories, and we're going to link to a few of them in the show notes and in the newsletter so you can check out more of her work there.
Yep. And you can follow us on Twitter. We are at Real Hot Take, and I am at Mary Hegler, and Amy is at Amy Westervelt.
Westervelt. That's right.
Westervelt, yeah. That's how you say that.
Yes, that's right. So follow us on there, sign up for the newsletter, and we'll see you next time.
All right, keep fucking that chicken.
You got me that time because you hadn't said it for a while.